Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here. I enjoy doing this. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is not too far from here, so it's nice to be back on the East Coast. Yeah, my email address is here. Please feel free to email me should you have any follow-up questions, concerns, or requests. This is the outline of the talk I'm going to give you. I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Craig talked about this morning in terms of network influences and behavior, and then reserve most of the time talking about networks for interventions and program implementation. And network influences on behavior, I don't need to tell you, incredibly important. That's why you're here. That's what you want to know. And when I think about network influences on behavior, I think of this little stylized egocentric network, a person that's connected to 6 others. And the first people to actually estimate exposure models as influences on behavior was Rogers and Kincaid using Bill Richards' program. And basically the idea is as your friends do something, you're more likely to do something. Network exposure being that driver for behavior change. I call it the workhorse for diffusion studies. And then we also know that the other thing that happens, of course, as your network fills with adopters, it can also end up with people you perceive to be users regardless of whether they're users or not, right? So those perceived behaviors by your alters influence behavior more than their actual self-reported behavior. And we have about 3 or 4 studies that we've done in the tobacco world and in the contraceptive world that have demonstrated that. We also know these so-called Semelian ties, right? The ties that are between alters that connect people to each other have stronger influences on ego than either individual would by themselves because the influences become reinforcing. And then, of course, we have personal network density. A person in a network whose alters are all connected to one another is going to have stronger influences on their behavior than one in which those ties reach out into the network, the so-called constraint measure that you've already heard somewhat about. And then there's tie strength, right? There's a lot of people that make a lot of noise over the strength of weak ties. Great article, great scholar, great line of work. But I argue that tie strength matters a lot for the more consequential the behavior. So the bigger decision I'm going to make, the more important I'm going to rely on strong ties rather than weak ties. And Granovetter makes the point that weak ties are very good for information flow, not necessarily for behavioral influence. And then, of course, we can look at indirect ties, right? And there's a lot of debate on whether or not indirect ties can influence ego. I argued as far back as my 1995 book on network models of diffusion of innovations that you could go out 2 steps. That's what we modeled. And we modeled the influence of indirect ties inversely to their distance from ego. So somebody 2 steps away would have their influence cut in half. And then, of course, whether or not the intermediaries need to be users or not to transmit that influence is an open question. Christakis and Fowler argued for 3 steps, and so I think it's an open research question and probably varies a lot depending on the application and the setting. We can also weight network influences by network indicators, right? So for example, in the adolescent context, you might think that popular students have stronger influences on others than non-popular students. And so we can calculate all of these different centrality metrics and all other kinds of individual metrics and use those as weights on personal network exposure. And then, of course, the insight and research track by Ron Burt to look at structural equivalence. Structural equivalence being a mechanism by which people influence one another, regardless of whether they're directly connected to each other. And of course, the mechanism that he argued for that is one of competition. You could imagine firms competing with one another. I like to argue that the minute McDonald's gave away little plastic toys, Burger King had to start doing something at the same time, right? There's competition. We model the behavior of those that occupy similar structural positions that we do. All right, and so the idea that you can have indirect influences and the idea that you can have structural equivalence influences means what you can also do is contract or expand that sphere of influence, right? So we can look only at direct ties or indirect ties or ties of ties of ties of ties, a flow matrix, if you will. When Ron Burt did his structural equivalence analysis on structural equivalence influences on the medical innovation data, he raised that structural equivalence matrix to successive powers to find the one that fit the data the best. So we can expand or contract that sphere of influence. And then, of course, my own discovery during my dissertation research was the notion of thresholds, right? Not everybody waits till everybody in their network does something before they're willing to do it. If we all did, nothing would ever diffuse. There have to be people in the system, in the community, that are willing to adopt behaviors when one or none of their partners do so, and others who wait until their network fills with adopters before they're willing to do so. I am a high threshold adopter. Why am I a high threshold adopter? Because I'm smart. Right? Why would I do something before everybody else does it? That's just plain old stupid. People that do that to me are crazy. But they like being early in their network to adopt. They like to get more information about it and then communicate that information to the people in their network. They're the ones that line up outside of the Apple store the minute a new phone's coming out, right? They want to see what the features are, and they do something I would never and have never done in my entire life, which is read the manual, right? This is what people hate me for, but they read the manual because they want to know what are the features that I'm getting in this new thing. And then here's a graph from the classic Korean family planning data set where you see you can graph people by whether they're early or late adopters, but also whether they're early or late relative to their network, right? So you can find people like number 11 or 20 that would normally be classified as innovative as early adopters, but yet they're actually waiting until everybody in their network adopts before they're willing to adopt. And we label these people over here, these late adopters, right? But they're late because where they are in the system, where they are in the communication network, makes them exposed to the innovation at a late time. And then, of course, online versus offline influences. There was a little bit of discussion about this earlier. The evidence seems to be that you can be influenced by those online, those computer-mediated communications. The magnitude of that influence is a lot less, but of course the number of contacts and communications you can have is a lot more. And then we can also weight exposures by joint participation in activities and events, the so-called bipartite or two-mode network. You know, we showed that kids who are friends that are also on the same sports team are more likely to be influenced by those friends than those that don't share a sports team, right? So you have that joint participation and identification. Then of course, you have attributes, right? Nodes are people too. They have attributes. They can be male or female, different ethnicities and whatnot. And communication theory has long argued that people are more likely to be influenced by homophilous ties than by heterophilous ones. So weighting it by that homophily can matter. And then finally, the last thing we can do, which is really cool, which I'll try to illustrate real quickly here, is here's a little stylized network of 8 nodes. The node labels are A through H. The time of adoption, in other words, the time when they adopted a new behavior, is listed there in the second column. If I reshape these data, so now each row is a person, each column is a time period, and what I'm illustrating here is that for person A, right, they are connected to 5 other individuals. 3 of those individuals adopted before A did, so their threshold is 60%. However, you'll notice that there's only one person who adopted at the time period immediately before A did. That's person B. And that is B's susceptibility. You are susceptible to the extent to which the people you're connected to adopt in the time period immediately before you do. And the converse of that is infectiousness, right? You're infectious to the extent to which people that are connected to you adopt immediately after you do. And so you can switch the direction of those arrows if you want, depending on the relation that you're looking at, but you can actually model explicitly susceptibility and influence through network diffusion models. So, and I'll just say we have a R library called NetDiffuser that makes doing all of those things as easy as toggling a switch, right? So earlier Jiten was talking about how he had done network analysis in SAS and then something else and then something else. And in fact, yes, I did my PhD dissertation writing code in SAS proc IML to estimate network diffusion models. Got to Hopkins, everybody there was using Gauss for network analysis. Great, rewrite everything in Gauss, wonderful. In the early 2000s, we get R. Now we rewrite everything in R. But fortunately, I think this is... Love it. So anyway, we have and we're still working on the package, but it does a lot of neat things very quickly and easily. So I like to say that's networks of behavior change, right? But what you're really more interested in, at least what I've become more interested in lately, is networks for behavior change, right? If networks are so important, how do we use them to improve our behavior change programs? And one paper we did back in 2015 was to think about social network analysis for program implementation. This has a very snappy acronym, which I like. I'm usually not too good at that, but we have it now. And the idea is basically quite simple, right? We have stages in the implementation process. These are well known. We took one of these frameworks and then talk about at each stage of the implementation process, what do we do from a network perspective to improve our programs? And the first step, of course, is a needs assessment, or so-called exploration. Then we design programs, we implement them, and then we monitor them. And so just thinking about networks during the exploration stage helps us think about, is there a network that we can work with? What's the network look like? What positions are the people in that network who are informing program development and design? So I like to look at a little network like this, right? Typically, we think we're developing a program. We think we have the pulse of those that are most central in the program, that are providing input to help us co-design and co-develop the program. But of course, we're not attuned to the isolates who may be very much in need of the program activities or services. And of course, typically what you get is subgroups that are completely almost disconnected, that may oftentimes see the development of this program in opposition of exactly what they do. So I think when we think of the community as network, we get much more explicit about finding who's providing input to the program, who's designing it, and whose voices are we listening to. Now, what's more exciting to me is using networks for program design, right? And so here we talk about, bless you, network interventions. And a lot of this work stems from a paper that I published in 2010 in Science on network interventions. And I give, not surprisingly, a very broad definition of what they are, right? So any purposeful efforts to use network data to try to accelerate behavior change, improve performance, achieve desirable outcomes across all different levels of analysis. And before I jump into networks interventions, there are a couple of principles that I want to highlight that are critical for all behavior change programs, but become heightened in the context of network data. And that is that our program goals matter, right? So often when we're working to promote physical activity or try to reduce substance use, we have a straightforward kind of goal. But when we think about it in a network context, it actually drives the kind of network intervention we may choose, right? In some settings, we want to accelerate behavior change, and in others, maybe the same setting, but we're working on a different goal or objective where we're trying to slow the spread of something. So that matters a lot, and I like to say that network interventions are not agnostic to the behavior under study. The other thing, and this was the hardest lesson for me to learn, my original training was in math. I didn't have social science other than a cultural anthropology class as an undergrad. And when I got to the social sciences, I thought, we can't explain what people do. Some days I sit on the couch all day. Other days I get up and go play frisbee, ultimate frisbee or something, right? So people are hard to predict. But I do believe at this stage of the game, we actually have a pretty good understanding of what drives people's behavior, what the motivations are, and what the barriers are. Do we invest enough money in doing it? No, but I think we know how to do it if we were given the resources. And then finally, my original goal with network interventions was to create a program that people could go out in the field, push the lever, change the community, send me the bucket loads of money, give me glory and fame, and I'd be done, right? But that's actually not how it works. You end up learning a lot. You use the networks to learn from the community. What's working, what's not working, how do we assist them in their behavior change activities. So here's the table. If you get nothing else out of this lecture, this table's become relatively famous. It's liked more than I am, by the way. So we have different strategies, and this comes from political and marketing campaigns. Strategies, your highest level, then you have your tactics, and then you have your operationalizations. And you'll hear in this political season, right, the Biden strategy for getting certain kinds of vote populations, or the Trump has no strategy, actually. So you have at the highest level, you're going to identify people to be change agents that you're going to use to change your program. And typically when we do that, we think about identifying the leaders, right? That makes the most sense. And when you go into an organization and you tell the boss, We're going to collect network data to find out that you're a leader in this organization and what you can do to change. He gives you the contract money, and then you collect the data and find out he's not the leader. That leads to a whole other conversation. But typically, that's our goal. And now you know from network analysis, we have lots of ways to find the most central node in a network, right? Degree, closeness, betweenness, eigenvector, power, you name it. In fact, David Scotch has a website with 100 different centrality measures. But we always use in-degree centrality, which I'll talk about in a second. But there are good reasons you might want to choose other kinds of change agents or champions, right? If you've got a highly fragmented network, maybe you want to identify the bridges to make that network more cohesive, or identify key players, a la Steve Brigati's algorithm. Or if you know the low thresholds, if you know what the threshold distribution is, find those low threshold people and have them be your first adopters. So, typically, we do network identified opinion leaders. We have a lot of experience with this. It's easy to measure, right? And it's very intuitive. You just go tell people, I'm going to count up who gets nominated the most. They're popular. We're going to use them. It's been proven effective. In 2008, we did a review paper. And my goal in that paper was to find out the way we use opinion leaders and community members to assist in behavior change programs. And I was pretty convinced that we didn't use networks at all. And so my intention was to show that we don't do this and we should do this. And I'd even written the first draft of the discussion of the paper before we got all the data. Sure enough, what happens? We find 20 studies across a number of different applications that have all used network data to identify opinion leaders, use them as champions, and bring about significant changes by doing so. Nothing different than collecting network data and identifying the opinion leaders. Now, why was this unknown to me and why was it unknown to most people? Because those studies had all been conducted in different application areas. HIV prevention in bars and communities, HIV prevention in low-income communities, treatment of acute myocardial infarction, treatment of vaginal birth after first C-section. They were literally spread all across the NIH, basically. And as you know, NIH is organized by organ and disease, not by health. And so, as a consequence, none of these studies were aware of each other. Oh, and this is the table. See, my thought was we're going to get to here and be done, right? But it turns out we also had all that as well, which worked really incredibly well. We've run simulations. You see the network with those highest on in-degree centrality. You get faster diffusion and more prevalent diffusion compared to opinion leaders selected randomly. And we also tested the marginal condition. Why the marginal condition? Because in fact, many innovations originate on the margins of the network. People that are on the periphery are free to innovate. They're not constrained by the network, and in fact, they don't even like the network because it's not doing anything for them. So they're happy to turn it upside down. And then this Cochrane review came out in 2011. They end up showing a 12 percentage point increase in compliance just by using network identified opinion leaders across the same interventions compared to other interventions. This is a huge effect. When we power our public health interventions, what do we power them for? 3%, 5% at best, right? If you can get a 12% uplift, man, back the truck up, take the money. So why do we use in-degree centrality? Well, it's very easy to calculate, right? All I have to do is, put the sum at the bottom of an Excel spreadsheet, and I've got my numbers. It's easy to explain. And you can compare your in-degree scores with other centrality measures and along with key player to find out how well they work. And why are in-degree opinion leaders so effective? Well, if you just basically look at the data, right? If I take the top 5 people who receive nominations in this network, they account for 37% of the incoming ties. If I take a random 5 people from the network, they only account for 10.5%. So just by selecting those opinion leaders first, in the first time period of data, I've got 3.5 times as much network exposure as I would otherwise. That's a lot. Right? And we know that a lot of networks have scale-free centralized structures, and so as a consequence, it's generally always going to be the case that those opinion leaders have an undue influence in the network. Other reasons we use in-degree centrality, it's robust to missing data, right? Jim was talking about some results earlier from their work. We did work earlier. It turns out in-degree centrality is incredibly robust to missing. Other centrality measures, not so much. And then, of course, we've done simulations and prior work and whatnot, and it just works really well. It's incredibly flexible. And then finally, there's a whole area of science to be done about what do we do with these people once we identify them, right? And if you look across a lot of the studies that we reviewed and even the different ones I've been involved in, sometimes it's, let's just find those people, give them a button and say, you're off and away. Or we go all the way over here and say, you're doing grand rounds, you're going to start going on a book tour, we are going to make you an amazing individual. So there's a broad range of implementation issues to be worked out in terms of what works and what doesn't. Then, of course, we can identify bridging noses, and I like to bring this up because I'm guilty as anybody on this. We have a central preoccupation in the network field for identifying central nodes and creating centrality algorithms, right? You publish a centrality algorithm, you've got a badge there. You know, it's like a stripe in the military or something. And as I said, Scotch has already identified 100 different ones. But we don't spend very much time identifying bridges. And there are good reasons that bridges may be very successful, right? For one, they're not packed in the middle of the network, and so they're not having all of this constraint on them. They're actually free to innovate. And because they're bridges, they may be more amenable to change because they're connecting to different subgroups and different communities. There are 3 ways to, and this is one of the reasons I actually like this, to talk about this, because I get to talk about my own work on coming up with algorithms for identifying bridging nodes. So BERT's inverse constraint works incredibly well. And then we've introduced 2 others using sociometric measures of bridging, which are still not quite coded up entirely, unfortunately. And then you can identify isolates or peripherals. And again, if you know the threshold distribution for a community, finding those low threshold individuals to start your cascade process makes a lot of sense, right? Because they're used to adopting before their peers do, and probably are familiar with being an early adopter relative to their peers. Okay. All right, and then very simply, it turns out doing this stuff is not very complicated. All you got to do is collect your network data, count up your nominations to identify your opinion leaders, recruit them to be champions, and then here's where things can get tricky, right? Because sometimes they're not on board with what you want to do. You know, we've done smoking prevention programs, and sure enough, you're going to identify leaders for subgroups that are already smoking, doing dope, getting drunk, you know, like my son did in high school. And so you've got to work with getting them on board for whatever you're doing. Now, a lot of times they will. Like when you're working in clinical settings, the identified opinion leaders are already on board. They know that this is something that they care about and people are excited about. And then your job is to just help them get their job done. And again, back to that slide on learning, and learn from them. What's working, what's not working. So when you go to the next setting, you're able to do that. So the next strategy is segmentation. I won't spend much more time on all these different strategies and tactics, but one approach which makes a lot of sense is to direct the intervention towards a whole group, subgroup at the same time, right? There are some ideas, some behaviors that can only be adopted when everybody adopts them. Like Facebook is a classic example. Interdependent innovation. It takes everybody to do it. Facebook got a good start by getting everybody at Harvard to log on and join the system at the same time. So it immediately had value, right? You know, if you get join a social media, social networking site, and none of your friends are on it, yeah, you can post your own pictures and look at yourself, but there's really not much value to it. You have to have other users in your system. And now I won't go into all the details on groups. I will say, though, that when they started introducing the community detection techniques that Jim talked about earlier, that was a godsend for interventions, because now you get mutually exclusive groups and you get a modularity index that tells you how important those groups are. And if you're working in a setting where that modularity is very high, that tells you that the group structure is going to make a big difference to your intervention. Okay, that's just a pretty diagram. Again, implementation issues for that. And then the other strategy that's really interesting is this idea of induction. And both strategies 1 and 2 are a little bit descriptive and a little bit static. But what induction strategy tries to do is actually use the network, excite the network, and build on that network structure. And the classic induction strategy, a tactic was always word of mouth, right? Going back to the very beginning days of advertising, the idea was to get people to talk about your product, make it exciting, and so on. Try to get it to go viral. And what's interesting now is this has actually become instantiated with online platforms, right? Whenever I buy a ticket to a football game on StubHub, they're like, hey, tell all your friends are going, invite them, make it a party. And then there's a bunch of studies on snowball sampling and respondent-driven sampling. Some people push back a little bit and say that respondent-driven sampling is not an intervention technique. It's merely a technique to get parameter estimates for typically quote-unquote hard-to-reach populations. But actually, a lot of respondent-driven studies have an intervention component built into it. And I would argue the fact that they're participating in the doggone thing is an intervention in and of itself. And then the third one is network outreach. Carl Latkin at Johns Hopkins University has done a lot of this work where you grab a piece of your network, bring them into an intervention, and have the intervention together as a group. The idea is that that group is going to reinforce the behavior change. And again, many behaviors, particularly in the health domain, require your network to be supportive of it because you're trying to change habits. You're trying to change eating habits and exercise habits in a household. So it helps to have the whole household on board. And then the last tactic I'll talk about is one that we created a while ago, which is this notion of identifying opinion leaders, but not thinking that they're just going to go off and do their thing. We can actually identify peer opinion leaders and match them to the people who nominated them. And I thought this was a rather clever insight, right? So you take a network like this and you go, okay, who are the most important nodes? 23, 32, 26, 29, and so on. Well, rather than just identifying them and handing them batons, let's go ahead and match them to the people who nominated them or were closest to them sociometrically. So now I'm influencing the people that nominated me, right? Right? Us Biden supporters are not going to all of a sudden listen to something that Trump says. It's just not going to happen. Our networks break up into tribes and clans, and we listen to our peer opinion leaders. And I think of this particularly in the adolescent context, where you go into any decent-sized adolescent high school, you're going to see lots of different subgroups and kids who are leaders for different subgroups. And you know, I won't go into this in detail. I like this study because I learned so much about it, but it was basically we were testing a culturally tailored smoking prevention program against the standard social influences one, and we were able to test this network matching algorithm to see if it did better compared to finding groups. So we identified peer opinion leaders the way we always had in school-based programs. We had teachers identify leaders and put kids in groups, and then we used my network algorithm to identify the most popular kids. They would be the same ones that you'd find here, only constructing the groups through the network ties. And just real quickly, I'll show you, we ended up getting significant, weak, but significant effects in the network condition. And mind you, the only thing we did differently is construct the groups using the network data. No additional costs. And when we looked at outcomes, we found out that it really knocked down susceptibility to smoke, which is incredibly predictive of eventually becoming a smoker. And then in our one-year outcomes, we got a finding that said, wow, the teachers did better than my algorithm. Nobody was surprised by that. I'm not a great mathematician and certainly not a great programmer. But the teachers did better. And the teachers did better because they knew the kids. They did this in April, right? And so they knew, and they did it along ethnic lines more so than the network did. And it was so funny because when I got this result, I thought, oh, Journal of School Health, that's got like an impact factor of 500. This is going to go in there. They're going to love it. I send it off to School Health, and they're like, nah, desk reject, not interesting. You got to be kidding me. Okay. So the network algorithm, it was more appealing when we asked the kids about whether or not they liked the program. It reduced pro-tobacco attitudes, it reduced susceptibility, but its effect was dependent on curriculum. And this is a point when I do a workshop on this that I hammer home. We never think about how people consume our programs. And I guarantee you, if I watch a movie or a TV series with some people, I'm going to react differently than when I watch it with somebody else, right? That network context of program delivery and program consumption is actually critically important that we generally tend to ignore. Okay, and then finally, originally I called this manipulation and realized that this is probably not the right label I want to use for this strategy, and so I thought alteration sounds better. You know, I'm a tailor, just going to take in a tuck here or there, let something out, make it more comfortable. So there are different kinds of alterations that you can do, right? You can delete or add nodes to a network, you can delete or add links to a network, or you can rewire the entire network based on some properties. And so the way we do this is we calculate a network metric. I generally use cohesion. A lot of people use that, basically the inverse of the average path length. Delete a node, recalculate the metric, calculate the difference. Those with the largest difference are the most important. And this, of course, is the vitality centrality measure that you will find. And Everett and Borgatti expand on this a little bit in their induced centrality paper. More interesting is the idea of adding or deleting links, right? It's the same process. You calculate your network metric, delete a link, recalculate the metric, calculate the difference. The links with the largest difference are the most important in the network, right? And this really was Granovetter's insight. If you go back and read that Strength of Weak Ties article, his argument was those ties, when removed, increase overall path lengths the most in the network, are the most important. So really just building exactly on what he said. And in fact, so you can do this at the same time for both deleting existing links and adding non-existing links to find out which links make the most sense to add to the network. You can put all this in a change matrix, and then you can start to analyze this change matrix as a way to understand the network structure. And you can, in fact, do this for lots of different metrics, right? You could do it for centralization measures, transitivity, modularity, and whatnot. Put it all into a gigantic array and just have the time of your life analyzing network data. There are implementation issues with alteration. It's not clear which network metric to maximize. And of course, getting into the business of deleting and adding links in the network is a little bit tricky, right? People have friends because they like those people. They have enemies or people they don't like, and they don't associate with them. And those things are hard to change. And I don't think we're going to get much perch on making these kinds of changes, but I think if we did, we'd learn a lot about human behavior and human social systems. Okay. And then finally, we can rewire networks to have global properties, right? We can take an empirical network and make it a small world network. We can make it a centralized network. And most importantly, and this is something that actually happens all the time, we just don't document it, we can rewire a network to match users with non-users, right? That happens all the time, a buddy system that you have and whatnot. And so this is a very logical thing to do. And teachers do it in schools all the time, but we never document it. And there's that. Okay. So back to this table. It's a beautiful table. It's been expanded a little bit by a couple of other folks and adapted to different applications. I always like to say we have an R script. Yes? Vitality. So it's the name that they gave to this centrality measure in which the person whose removal increases path lengths the most in a network. It's in a very obscure edited network book. Okay, so after you've now done your network exploration, you've figured out what's going on, you've designed a network intervention, oftentimes network interventions are being implemented in group and different kinds of settings. And so a number of years ago, we came up with this idea of developing network diagnostics. And the idea is quite simply that while you're doing an intervention, you can keep track of these different kinds of metrics. And we wrote this paper up and put these metrics into a table and sent it off to a journal, and all three reviewers came back and said, where did you get these values from? You know, who says it has to be greater than 0.5? What do you mean it's supposed to be 0? Where did you get these from? And I thought, well, here goes. I just made it up. Nobody's done this before. I've been doing this stuff for a while. I have no idea. And it surprised the heck out of me. All three reviewers came back and said, yeah, that seems fine. It's like, when do they ever do that? It's funny as heck. So, and then I want to just segue a little bit into the notion of different networks. A lot of times we talk about networks and we don't talk about which networks we measure. And evidence has certainly emerged. Bria Perry, who was here earlier, talks about the network episodic method model where, you know, they know that people go to different kinds of people for different kinds of resources and activities. And usually with a lot of the work that I do, I tend to measure advice and discussion. Advice tapping into expertise and discussion tapping into trustworthiness. Now this goes all the way back to the Coleman, Katz, and Menzel study that you heard about before. They measured advice, discussion, and friendship amongst the physicians in the 4 Illinois communities that they measured the adoption of tetracycline. And different networks may require different strategies. And I oftentimes think that if you're looking at advice networks, you're probably going to be thinking about identifying opinion leaders. But if you're going to be working in groups and segmentation, you may be more inclined to work with discussion networks. And I argue that, in fact, many people, this behavior change process and the effectiveness of leaders depends on their expertise and their trust. And ideally, you find the folks down here that know what they're doing and people trust that they have the community's best interests in their heart. High in expertise, high in trust. And you can find people. I've done lots of studies where you find people that are very high in expertise but not trust, and vice versa. And I like to think of these along these 2 dimensions of vertical versus horizontal, right? Advice seeking is expertise. It generally tends to be much more hierarchical, much more asymmetric, whereas discussion and trust are horizontal, right? It's going to be with your peers. That's who you discuss matters with. And if you're in a situation where the barrier to change is technical, then expertise becomes critically important, right? People don't know how to do it. They need to be taught how to do it. On the other hand, in many settings, our behavior change barriers are cultural. People don't know what to do or even why they should do anything. Then trust becomes critically important and is an important network to work with. So the advantages of network methods are they capitalize on existing interpersonal relationships. They use community input. I argue that many of them will be effective simply because you've solicited input from the community to participate. People feel empowered, emboldened. You establish a learning organization and a learning community by identifying opinion leaders and matching them to those who nominated them. It's directly linked to all these concepts of social capital that we talk about. And from a scientific perspective, it gives us something that can be replicated. And we can measure the fidelity of our interventions, right? How important were the opinion leaders relative to other people in the community? How much modularity is in the network, and therefore it made a difference for us to identify subgroups. It really expands our array of intervention options, and of course, most critically, it creates data. I was telling somebody the story earlier yesterday about how school-based prevention programs, the teachers would oftentimes put the roster up on an overhead, back in the days when we had those overhead things, and give numbers to the kids in the roster and then tell the students, write down the numbers of the top five you think would be a good leader for a project in class, right? So then the teacher would collate all those papers, she'd tally them up. When she saw that Tom got a lot of nominations, she would immediately edit out the data. And then she would pick the top 5 that she liked, and then what would she do? She'd throw the data away, right? And that's network data. It's like, oh my God, all of that network data went into the waste can that we could have had and used so well. So I tried to do that quickly because I had a lot of slides, and that gives us about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. And if you're wondering, there is a draft book that covers all of this and how to do it that is almost through the wickets. Yeah, my pleasure. Yes, Pooja.
I couldn't help but think about how much overlap there is between designing network-based interventions and participant or community engaged research.
Right, yeah.
So I guess one question I had, because I know you mentioned with opinion leaders, sometimes they may not be on board with whatever program or agenda that a researcher has. Have you found in your work, or is there literature describing how to kind of engage opinion leaders in designing interventions?
No, that's a really good question, because every time I've done this, when we identify the opinion leaders, they're like, oh, this is great. Because they're already doing it. They know that they're an opinion leader in that domain, and now you're going to reward them right? And you're going to acknowledge it, and you're going to give them resources to do it better. So unfortunately, I don't run into very many situations where you have that resistance. It's out there, you know it's out there, but I think most of the time they're just going to fly under the radar, right? They're not going to be confrontational about it. They're just going to go, yeah, I can't show up that day. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but there isn't a literature on that. There isn't a literature, to my knowledge, of how you get them engaged. It is. And engagement is the key word that I've really latched on in the past couple of years, because it is getting people engaged in bringing about change. And a lot of people, it's a frustrating process, right? I mean, a lot of times we're working in settings where it's not easy to get people engaged because of all the barriers and time and resource constraints. And that's probably the biggest thing, is give them resources. Yeah, yes.
I was like, okay, we'll ask my question. You have a slide up there about, like, if this is the barrier, then this is the thing we should do. And if this is the barrier, but what if resources are the barrier?
Yeah, rob a bank. I mean, that's what Jesse James said. You know, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. But I think, yeah. but it's a really good point, and it frustrates me, and I'm sure it frustrates many of us, because we work in a capitalist country, right? And so everything is all about the money, but it's really all about the people who have money keeping the money and not investing it in communities that don't have the resources. So I think, unfortunately, a big part of the equation is the political policy process, which, you know, is not something I really feel like getting involved in, but there are people who do, and it's important that they do. But yeah, I think resources is a big part of the equation. Yeah, you can move a lot with a few dollars. Yeah. Jim. Oh, Gabe. Gabe, standing in for Jim.
I was wondering if you could talk about the way that a network intervention, might transform the positions of, say, the leaders that are in that network, and then how do you work to track that transformation of this, the network system as a whole, and do you sometimes, in preparing an intervention, think about how it's going to transform?
Yeah, and there's ethical issues there, right? We're tampering with the system, and we're reifying an existing hierarchy, perhaps, that we may want to be conscious of. And there isn't research done on what happens when we get people into an intervention, and down, 6 months, a year down the road, has their network position changed? And a lot of times, opinion leaders may be hesitant to get involved in intervention because they don't want to take a chance. If you're proposing something that's incompatible with the community, opinion leaders are going to delay adoption behavior, and they're probably going to be resistant to getting involved. So there's a cross between getting them involved in doing it, but also the fit of what you're trying to do, the cultural compatibility of it. There's a great study that a guy named Becker did back in, published in 1970, showing that for an innovation that is not compatible with the community, opinion leaders delay their adoption. Many people make the mistake of equating early adoption with opinion leadership, and those are two different things. They sometimes cross because once opinion leaders adopt, the innovation starts to spread rapidly, but that's just a mirage, right? If it's not compatible, they are going to be resistant. Now, I think there's a huge research opportunity to actually look at this. What happens when we tamper with networks for interventions, and how does the network change as a consequence? There's a really nice paper that a Dutch researcher did that I reference in the book. Waes is the last name, W-A-E-S, where they had kids in elementary school report on who they liked and disliked in the class. Then they rearranged the seating to put the dislikers near one another, and they started to like one another. Go figure. You talk to somebody and they turn out to be okay. Yeah. Yes. Sir. Oh, nice. Yeah. Well, Carl and I were at Hopkins together. Yeah.
And so I don't know if it's about like evaluating network change, but I know something that he does and we do is like if there are different points of intervention, assessing acceptability before designing the intervention. Like there's 500 million things you could intervene on, but what is the most acceptable? What's the path of least resistance? And then designing communication means based on like involving the community to see what could they share with their peers.
Yeah.
Especially when you're working with marginalized or innocent populations. As like that work has been primarily, Carl's work primarily relates to like people who use drugs.
Yeah. People who inject drugs. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, and he's done such a long career of really great work in this area, and he really embeds himself in it. The fun thing I found funny about working in Baltimore, though, the injection drug users there were so sophisticated, they would tell you what the going rate is for an incentive. It's an overstudied population. Yes, Jim.
Yeah, so we just finished a study of an intervention of fishermen in Victoria, and one of the things that we're struggling with trying to understand is that with an in-degree-based selection, so we got people based on in-degree, we gave them some training and told them they were leaders and they recruited their friends to do something. And it works great. All that's fine. But then we're trying to understand why. And in talking with people at the end, there's sort of two stories. One is that they're real opinion leaders. They really are some of the most popular, and people respected them and did what they said to do. The other option was that once they learned they were opinion leaders, they took pride in being opinion leaders, and then worked harder at convincing their peer group, who told and said they were leaders, to do it. And so we don't know which of those two mechanisms was true.
They're both true.
Do you think that if you just randomly picked people and told them they were leaders,
But you wouldn't get as much of a lift, right? I think it would still work, right? Because it's community based. But I don't think you'd get as much of a lift.
it'd be a lot cheaper?
Would it though? So it might be cheaper, but it might not be more cost effective. Look, I'm telling pharmaceutical companies are spending a couple $2 billion a year doing this stuff, and they do it for a reason. Yeah. So I think you're right. If you just built some people up, but see the people that you've identified through the networks, we know from research on what's correlated with high in degree. More personable, better communicators, taller, handsome. But these things, these personal characteristics as well as both physical and personal characteristics matter. And so I think, yes, they become better at doing their opinion leadership, but they're also naturally good at it, right? If I pluck people at random, some of those people are going to be good at it and take pride in it and say, yeah, I'm a leader. Others are just not going to have the skills, the traits, the talents to do it, right? So I don't know that it would be cheaper. I don't know that it would be more cost effective. It would certainly be cheaper, but then let's go back to how much of a lift we get, and is it worth it? And I argue for a lot of the things that we do in public health, that lift is critically important. Yeah, there's one in the back.
So building off of this a little bit, Kai Erickson wrote Everything in Its Path about the Buffalo Creek flood, and what happened was a flood came through and basically destroyed a community, and the government rehoused everyone in work. In fact, that's one of the main points of the book, is that it destroyed the community. And the point I take away from that is that it's very difficult to build, to rebuild, or reconstruct a network.
Absolutely, yeah.
That you can't just kind of like take a group of people and like rewire them.
I totally agree.
Yep. So can you say a little bit about that?
Because I think we don't have many examples of this, if any at all, or any that I know of that have been published. Because I think networks, some people argue that any network you measure is at its optimal shape because people have made choices. And we have that deliberately built into a lot of our network statistical models, that people are deliberate in the choices that they make of who they connect with, who they like and who they don't like. And characteristics such as sex and ethnicity also play a role in those things. So I don't think we'll be very successful rewiring networks unless there's a real critical reason and need to do so. Now, some architects try this, right? They rearrange offices to get people to, and they design offices to create more opportunities for interaction. But to my knowledge, I don't know of any study that's done that has demonstrated that it's been particularly effective. So I agree with you. I think rewiring communities and building communities is a difficult thing to do. Yeah.
Arguably, Facebook, Google, YouTube, all of these algorithms are doing exactly this.
Yeah. And I would say they're doing it in a poor way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they're reifying all our poor tendencies in terms of networks.
But it strikes me that they have the opportunity to do just the opposite. Right.
And that big LinkedIn experiment that they did demonstrates that. It has other ethical concerns, but that was a different approach, and it had incredible outcomes. So.
What was the experiment?
They I think it was 70 million users, and they randomly selected some to receive job recommendations or links from weak ties rather than strong ties, right? And those weak tie, the people who received those weak tie friend connections were more likely to apply for new jobs and get new jobs. That's a summary. Yes, Justin.
I'm curious about like the dynamics in these networks, and like especially with interventions, I noticed like we'll roll something out, and just as soon as it seems to be working, people like adapt to that language, and then it's like even with like social networks, like and people leave the networks or start hating them, or and like they reshape things, and then people react to that. And I'm wondering about. I know there are some people in complex intervention space that write about trying to study the dynamics ahead of time so that you can predict those things. I wonder, have you done any of that?
You know, I haven't. It's always a caution that networks are constantly changing, but it's my impression they don't change a lot, right? And I think we have evidence for that in a number of settings that they don't change a lot. They change some. But I also don't think people's position in the network changes very much, right? So there may be some swapping, dissolution, addition, and change of ties, but popular people remain popular, right? And I know Jim's done some work on this. I mean, I think they maintain their popularity for that simple measure, for example, over time. So I think it's a concern. I think it'd be a great thing to measure. I would love for people to start giving us money to do network interventions and track them over time. I can tell you when I was early on doing this, we did an intervention to try to get clinicians to diagnose and treat people with co-occurring disorders. And we had, treatment sites and control sites. And about a year and a half after the study, even after we published the data, we were doing a panel. This was in Florida. And one of the guys who was an opinion leader in one of these clinics, bless you, was there. And I said, oh, so how did it go? He goes, you wouldn't believe it. People are still asking me about co-occurring disorders. This is a year and a half later, after the intervention. And so, yes, the networks are changing, but network interventions, in my estimation, are way more sustainable than most everything else we do because the intervention stays there, right? Long after we leave. Even if other people have left or come in and out of the network. If you've trained opinion leaders to promote some kind of behavior in a setting, okay, some people leave and some new people come on. You still have that opinion leader doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? And then I'm new to the organization. It's like, co-occurring disorders, who do I talk to? Sam, he's the guy. Boom, it's done. Yes?
In understanding network interventions, has there been any type of coupling with conjoint choice experiment to understand, like, say, Mona Adams, like group membership? Because I could see where there's potential room if you conduct a survey and you know your network originally, and then you take those people and then ask them to choose between people one or two, and just kind of continue with options to see their
Who they prefer to learn from?
Yes.
Huh. No, I hadn't even thought about that.
I didn't know if there was any literature.
I hadn't come across anything like that. Sounds interesting. Also sounds a little labor intensive, but yeah. Yeah.
I mean, first round of anything.
Yeah, right.
Before we go into criminality here, let me take
Yeah.